I don't think either their white skin or their maleness makes them particularly privileged. And I do think that some groups in society today are more easily overlooked and are more worth sticking up for. But I guess the but then comes in. So my worry would be that, so it's not like my dad, my uncle, my brothers who are kind of unemployed, some of them working in factories, warehouses, supermarkets, care homes. You know, they're not going down the pub in the evening and saying, do you know what, we really need to start a men's rights movement. You know, they're busy at work with their families, getting on with their life, which is not to say that they don't have political views, that they don't have issues that they're concerned about. But they're not saying, hey, guys, do you know what? We need to form a men's rights movement. So my worry, as soon as you move on from saying it's really important to defend men in some circumstances, it's really important to defend groups of men in some circumstances, when you move beyond that and say, let's have a men's rights movement, you end up repeating, it becomes men who've got the time, the kind of concern, the wherewithal, or however you want to put it. And the danger is it again becomes the trade union for middle class men to have a voice at the table.
Hello and welcome to the show where I try and make a little sense out of this stunning and increasingly brave new world that we all live in by talking to a series of expert witnesses about their experiences, interests and concerns. And today I'm honoured to be talking sense not sensibility with academic, author and social commentator Joanna Williams. Joanna is the founder and director of the think tank KEO, which aims to look beyond the Westminster bubble and introduce new people and ideas into the political debate. She is the author of a number of books, including Academic Freedom in an Age of Conformity and Women versus Feminism, and she has been a frequent contributor to national and international debates on education and gender politics. Joanna is also a regular news reviewer for Sky News and associate editor of the online magazine Spiked. Spiked is where I first encountered Joanna's writing, of which I'm a great admirer of, and it was one or two of her articles on gender politics that specifically inspired me to reach out to her and invite her for this chat. Having observed her regular input into debates about both education and identity politics, I would personally regard Joanna as one of a number of women operating in the media today who can be extremely effective advocates for the human rights of boys and men. And yet, conversely, she has also from time to time been extremely critical of men's rights activists and initiatives such as International Men's Day, proposing that they invite a struggle for the high ground of victimhood and oppression one-upmanship. Given the inevitably divisive and dividing nature of identity politics, to some extent I can understand this perspective, but I am sometimes surprised at how dismissive high-profile critics of feminism such as Joanna can be of the notion of a men's human rights movement. So it was a subject I was keen to explore with her further. Joanna was kind enough to join me for a conversation which we recorded back in June. Over the hour we touch on a range of related subjects, including hate speech, the Equality Act, online abuse, and the pros and cons of establishing a government minister for men. But I kicked things off with a simple question and asked Joanna what is it she thinks about when she thinks of the term men's rights activist.
I suppose one of my general issues, you touched upon the idea of identity politics, is clearly, by definition, men's rights activist is concerned with men. So you're promoting an identity-based position, whereas I tend to think I have very little in common with people on the basis of genitalia. I have far more in common with people on the basis of what I think, my views. And I don't think my views stem from my genitals. I think my views stem from my brains. And I would like to think that I would have things in common with you. And if I didn't think I had things in common with you, I probably wouldn't have agreed to have a chat with you this evening. Sure. So for me, by very definition of defining a men's rights movement, you're suggesting that men, by dint of their genitalia, have something in common. And so I guess I would dispute that fundamental fact. For a start off, I've met lots of men who I find very pleasant. I'm married to one, I've given birth to two. I have lots of friends I count as men. I also know lots of men who I disagree with fundamentally on a huge range of issues, and I would say the same for women, for black people, brown people, white people, homosexual people, heterosexual people. I'm much more interested in what people think, what people do, what they believe in, rather than just the fact of their bodies. And I think the focus on bodies is very dehumanizing. It kind of reduces us to our biology. So that would be my first point. The second point, I guess, is that my concern with identity politics goes a bit beyond that into I'm very opposed to anything that begins life, if you like, from a grievance or from a victimhood perspective. And that's my beef with feminism today. I think feminism portrays women as victims, and that's why I have so many problems with feminism and don't describe myself as a feminist. And I guess then a men's rights movement that's going to say all men have got something in common, and what we have in common is a grievance or a victimhood, I just think is really unhelpful.
I completely understand where you're coming from on that, and certainly kind of particularly when I suppose when I kind of started down the journey of looking at what I would describe as male inequalities, which in itself is a term that, you know, is equalities even a word outside of civil servant speak. So, you know, I can completely identify with that. I remember reading an article once where you were kind of being very critical. I can't remember if it was International Women's Day or International Men's Day, but you were being very critical of both. And I totally kind of get that perspective. The difficulty, I suppose, the kind of main reason I do think there is merit in speaking up on behalf of men and boys, I guess, is because I guess kind of men's rights activists are often seen as a kind of mirror image of feminists, and you know, people can be very critical of feminists in the same way that, you know, they can be critical of men's rights activists. But I do think that one distinction is kind of the dictionary definition of feminism is really two. It's one, it's about an ideology, a political ideology, and two, it's about advocacy for women's rights, which is essentially, in this kind of day and age, it's turned into a union, a trade union for women, particularly, I would say, professional classes of women. So in that situation where some kind of fundamental human rights that, you know, have existed on the statute for a long time are being eroded from boys and men because there's nobody at the table to speak on their behalf, that's, I suppose, where I feel it's inevitable that somebody has to be there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. And I would like to think myself in the past, I've definitely been in situations where I have stood up for men and boys, both on particular issues. So I've been very concerned about education, and this might be something that we come on to talk about, but I've been very, very concerned about boys in schools. And I think that's a really important issue that's too easily overlooked. I'm very concerned about things like university consent classes and the kind of carte blanche portrayal of all young men as potential rapists. I think is incredibly damaging. So I think it is important that women stick up for men in issues like that. And also I think there are some groups of men that need sticking up for, if you like, a bit more than others. So you touched upon how feminism can become a trade union of a professional class of women, and I completely agree with you about that. And I think we see in the Black Lives Matter protest at the moment, it's very easy to get this assumption that kind of all white, particularly white men, have this privilege in life just by the fact of their birth. And I would really dispute that. And I come from a family of working class men, and I don't think any of them are particularly privileged just because of the circumstances of their biology. Again, it all boils down to biology. I don't think either their white skin or their maleness makes them particularly privileged. And I do think that some groups in society today are more easily overlooked and are more worth sticking up for. But I guess the but then comes in. So my worry would be that, so it's not like my dad, my uncle, my brothers, my dad's family, my dad's brothers, who are kind of unemployed, some of them working in factories, warehouses, supermarkets, care homes. You know, they're not going down the pub in the evening and saying, do you know what, we really need to start a men's rights movement. You know, they're busy at work with their families, getting on with their life, which is not to say that they don't have political views, that they don't have issues that they're concerned about. But they're not saying, hey, guys, do you know what? We need to form a men's rights movement. So my worry, as soon as you move on from saying it's really important to defend men in some circumstances, it's really important to defend groups of men in some circumstances, when you move beyond that and say, let's have a men's rights movement, you end up repeating, it becomes men who've got the time, the kind of concern, the wherewithal, or however you want to put it. And the danger is it again becomes the trade union for middle class men to have a voice at the table.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. And I suppose kind of, you know, one of the reasons I'm so keen to kind of tease this out with you is because I'm aware of so many of the, you know, kind of pitfalls and complexities. I would probably class myself as kind of very much in that sort of idiom that, you know, kind of I've been lucky enough to have a decent education. I've got the spare time to, you know, kind of write tweets and make my podcasts and stuff. And I agree, you know, kind of working class women generally don't have the time or the, you know, inclination. And absolutely, I don't think it's a coincidence that socioeconomic status is something that's missing from this kind of framework. So, well, I suppose then the question would be, I suppose the perspective I look at it, and I'd be interested to know what your thoughts on the Equality Act are as well, because, you know, from a starting point, I certainly think equality legislation has had some benefits and has been necessary in terms of defining rights around equal opportunity, you know, prevention of discrimination. The fundamental problem, as I see it, is that we've kind of moved to this direction of equality of outcome. And so then it becomes difficult because, yes, I agree boys are having trouble at school, but without identifying them as a group with genitals, for want of a better expression, it's, you know, kind of how do you address that whilst there is this all-encompassing framework already in existence, I guess, is maybe.
Yeah, no, it's really good, really important question. So I'm going to say something first of all, which I guess is kind of backtracking a little bit, but hopefully will lead up to an answer to your question. So one of the reasons why I'm critical of feminism, and one of the reasons why I would not define myself as a kind of men's rights activist or anything like that, is I guess I'm perhaps less interested in defending men as a group, but there are values. One of the big concerns I have nowadays is that there are values that we have traditionally as a society associated with men. Values I'm thinking like stoicism, resilience, strength, both physical strength and mental strength. I guess kind of bravery, courage. And one of my I think those values are brilliant, and I don't think there's anything specifically male about those values. I think they're values that everyone could and should aspire to. And one of the phrases that I hate more than any other is the phrase toxic masculinity.
Yes.
And often toxic masculinity is used to have a go at men, and it becomes a way of having a go at all men. But I think far more fundamentally, it actually has a go at those particular values. It's saying that these values, being brave, courageous, stoical, having strength, being resilient, these values are actually psychologically damaging and bad for people. Whereas I'll put my hand up and I'll say, if I'm in a burning building, I want somebody who's brave and courageous and strong and stoical, and I want that person to come and rescue me. Thank you very much. Yeah. And I think there's a real place in society for these values, and I think feminism is about destroying those values and wanting everybody to be kind of more in touch with their emotions, to kind of switch around a kind of outdated, the kind of masculine values that I've been describing are considered to be not just outdated but positively harmful and damaging for people. It's supposed to be kind of troublesome for people's mental health to have to put on a front of being brave and stoical. And when I look at what's going on in schools, it seems that one of the problems is this real kind of push to move from one values system to another value system, so a more feminized value system where we emote at every available opportunity. We talk about our feelings as if our feelings are the most important thing in the world, and we cry and we kind of clap each other for crying at the drop of a hat. And I think one of the problems is that, like I say, we've got this battle that appears to be a battle between men and women, but it's actually more a battle between these competing value systems. I don't know if that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, I basically agree. I think one of the difficulties in this whole area is feminism is such a kind of dominant ideology in the realm of identity politics or equality, or however you want to describe it. So therefore, it's very difficult not to engage with it and then obviously criticize it. The difficulty then is you start sort of playing their game, and then you do fall into that ghetto trap. I'm very conscious that kind of the majority of my audience for my podcast will probably very much agree with what we're talking about. So it's not, necessarily, challenging, kind of building bridges, I guess. We're all in these echo chambers.
But you see, I guess my concern is, and this is, I'm very open for you now to tell me that I'm wrong. But my concern with some of the things that I've seen with the men's rights movement, and hand up, I'm not an expert. I've not read or researched much around the men's rights movement. But one of my concerns, I guess, is that rather than defending these values, rather than saying, masculinity isn't toxic, and actually these values of stoicism, bravery, courage, strength of character, resilience, these are things to aspire to. And actually you could move beyond men. You could say these are things for everyone in society to aspire towards. My worry with some of the things I've seen from the men's rights movement is it almost falls into the trap of agreeing that masculinity can be toxic. So if you look at debates around mental health, for example, I've seen a number of men's rights activists actually arguing that it's the kind of pressure that's placed on boys in particular, but men in general, to have to put a brave face on it, to not be in touch with their emotions. That's actually very damaging for young boys. And I guess I want to say, actually, it's only damaging because we tell people it's damaging. And if we could actually say it's brilliant to have these values, then I think that would be much more positive.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. Because I think in the mental health aspect, I do think that yeah, I guess. Well, I suppose just to pull it back to the equality framework again, kind of men and specifically white men and specifically straight white men, but are kind of not only the benchmark that all the statistics are kind of compared against, but also they're essentially portrayed as the kind of perpetrator of all the ills. So I do think that kind of has an impact on kind of men's psyche, and I guess sort of men just like women are very kind of diverse and unique, and kind of will have all sorts of different approaches to life and outlooks. But if you're perceived as something, regardless of what you think, that has an impact. So I suppose that would be my thought on the mental health thing. I guess the kind of the real quandary then is I mean, let me give you an example of hate speech, and because I guess this is the sort of dilemma, because at the minute we're moving into the realm of gender being included in hate speech, and it probably will be in the next 5 years. Now, on the one hand, Scotland's moving to introduce misogyny only. Now, obviously, I think that's remarkable, given that we have the principle of equality in law. And so the obvious solution is to include misandry. But that's walking into the trap of, as opposed to not having either. If you get me, I would very much be of the latter view. But the difficulty is, it's that sort of thing. It's kind of like if everybody's sort of essentially debating from one perspective, how do you move it beyond that? I guess is maybe.
Yeah. So on that misogyny, I completely agree with you. I think this is utterly terrible, this idea of making misogyny a kind of hate crime, because, well, for so many reasons, it's so loosely defined, it's so subjectively experienced, and you could be rounding up hundreds of thousands of people for potential hate crimes, and it opens the door for so many people with petty grievances to I don't need to tell you what's wrong with it. You know exactly what's wrong with this. But as you say, the trap then is to argue for a mirror law, and this is where you see with all these identity groupings like the Equality Act, people just end up bidding to outdo each other or bidding for the same. I disagree with this for so many reasons. So first of all, it presents men as victims. The reason why I hate the idea of misogyny being a hate crime is because it suggests to me and to young women in very powerful positions that we are constantly victims in society. We're going to be abused as soon as we leave our front door, and we need to be on guard for this and get ready to report it. But more to the point, it makes people very, very powerless. So yeah, people do say bad things to me, not so much now, but when I was younger, people would whistle or look or say something. But there's a huge difference between standing up for yourself and turning around and telling that person to F off, or just walking away, or just dealing with it. Whereas the idea that both men and women should be rushing off to the authorities or the police like pathetic babies saying, we can't cope because somebody looked at us in a bad way, please sort this out for us, whether that's the boss at work or the police or, somebody thought a bad thought about me, reduces everybody in society down to that level of pathetic infants, really. And I'd really strongly object to that. I mean, I, for one, will be writing and tweeting and doing everything I can to try and make sure that misogyny is not introduced as a hate crime. But, this links nicely then to the points that you were making about the Equalities Act and broader points about the Equalities Act. Now, I agree, perhaps some legislation was necessary. I mean, if you go back to the early 1970s, I think the Equal Pay Act, I don't agree with a lot of the campaigns nowadays around the gender pay gap, for all kinds of reasons I'm sure you're familiar with. But I think if you go back to the 1970s, actually having equal pay legislation was probably a sensible thing to do. But now, the way the Equalities Act operates in the workplace, it hands power over to bosses, essentially, to police every aspect of people's lives. And I'm very opposed to that. But also, more my opposition would be based on the fact that, again, kind of constant theme of what we're talking about here, it divides everybody up according to biology. Yeah. Now, I think in the workplace, you've essentially got two groups, and I'm going to sound really old-fashioned here, and I'm going to sound like an old-fashioned Marxist, but you've got workers, you've got people who are going to work, needing the money and being told what to do. And you've got either bosses or owners who are doing the ones either doing the hiring and paying the wages or telling other people what to do. Yeah. And, I think there you've got two very, very clear competing interest groups. And I think the more the bosses or the people who are owning and paying the wages are able to divide everybody else up, the black people, the brown people, the white people, the gay people, the straight people, the trans people, the cis people, the male people, the female people, if you can create 15 different groups all squabbling amongst themselves, yeah, and all running off to the boss saying, help me, the bosses are just laughing, and you put that into society at wide. The police are laughing, the government's laughing. Everyone's looking to the state to step in and help them sort out these squabbles that they then helped create by creating and reinforcing the idea that all these identity groups exist. We've got nothing in common with each other, that my interests are best served by knocking you down and your interests are best served by knocking me down. And that's bollocks to you, sir.
Yeah, either knock each other down or agree to sort of cut the cake up and keep our own separate bits. And I 100% agree. And kind of just to explain, my kind of background is in the kind of a sort of equality law and human relations law. And kind of the first point I got to in terms of the journey, which brought me to doing this podcast, was very much that point, the kind of realization that sort of, the likes of pregnancy discrimination legislation was very necessary, and I would argue is still very relevant today, particularly in situations, like the COVID situation, where a pregnant worker is kind of more vulnerable. But it obviously to some extent has introduced a grievance culture, which creates a culture of caution, whether that's in the workplace or whether that's even in public discourse. And I do, it is essentially a divide and conquer situation. I kind of initially sort of just dipped my sort of hand into the likes of kind of Guardian discussion forums, because my impression... No, I know. Brave. They banned me very quickly for promoting equality of opportunity. It's quite an eye-opening moment. But the kind of my motivation was my kind of perception of men's rights activists was that they were kind of very angry, abusive, and kind of possibly slightly lost individuals. And that was very much my perception. But very quickly, I kind of learned that they really weren't, and possibly one of and some of them, some people are very burnt by their experience, but kind of certainly one of the key indicators of a lot of people who are kind of sort of active in the men's rights movement are because they have actively been burnt by generally the state, whether it's kind of family courts or the likes of kind of parental separation, or kind of impact, particularly around divorce, etc., or the stigma that they're seeing placed on their children. So it's kind of, from my perspective, it tends to be more about sort of rights that, strictly speaking, are in the statute books, but are being denied of people because, particularly the feminist movement, is just moving further and further into grabbing power and shifting the advantage to a certain class of women, because it is generally kind of I certainly see that a lot of it is focusing at those plum top jobs as opposed to necessarily helping kind of certain professional feminists nannies or cleaners or whatever. So, any thoughts about that?
Yeah, no, I agree with you completely. Although, I mean, I have to say, speaking very, very personally,
Okay.
and just purely in personal experience, when I've written things or taken part in debates, I am very lucky. I have to say, over the years, I've received very, very little abuse from anyone, and it always makes me slightly skeptical sometimes, particularly when, again, from a feminist perspective, you hear calls for new laws. I think Amnesty International have run whole campaigns off the back of calling for kind of greater regulation of the internet for women, because women kind of can't cope using Twitter and social media. And I often think, well, what's wrong with me? No, I'm joking. But I've been very lucky, I guess, or either I'm very lucky or some of this kind of scale of abuse is exaggerated.
Well, if I can maybe interject, because I would certainly be leaning to the side that yes, absolutely, some of it, kind of, we all know that offence can be weaponized, and that is something. I actually contacted Amnesty at the time of their study where they found that Diane Abbott was the most abused female MP, and that's something that keeps seeming to be overlooked, that she was the most abused female MP. And initially they were very keen to kind of do a Facebook thing with me or Skype thing with me. But when I sort of set out a few questions, which kind of maybe revealed slightly more of my motive, like, for example, was Theresa May not considered in that? Surely she must have got a bit of abuse. It became clear that their entire methodology was fixed and they know it. Yeah.
No, this is true. So I think two things that make it overstated. I think it's, as you say, it's the methodology, it's what you look for, but also offence, as we know, is very, very subjective. So, three people could read the exact same comment. One person shrugs and doesn't think about it again, and another person loses sleep for a week over the exact same comments, and a third person runs off and complains to Amnesty International. So this is why measuring, even labeling something as hate speech or offensive speech, I think is ridiculous to start with, because sure, we could come up with a list of words which we thought were perhaps objectively bad, but generally these things are very subjective. But so I do think there is a huge amount of overstatement as far as this goes. But it's not to say that I've never come across kind of people being nasty to me online. And I have to say, kind of with due respect to what you were just saying,
okay.
There tend to be two groups of people who I have had some kind of quite horrible run-ins with. And there are some angry men, I'm afraid, in the men's rights movement, or maybe not in it, I don't know about in it, but who associate themselves with it, who have said some very vile and abusive things to me in the past. And it's almost as if they can be more vile and abusive towards me, perhaps, than some other women, because there is an expectation that I will be entirely uncritically on their side because I've criticised feminism in the past. Sure. So I think if a feminist also criticises the men's rights movement, they'll roll their eyes and say, well, what do you expect? She's a feminist. Yeah. Whereas if I say things that are critical of the men's rights movement, obviously, absolutely not across the board, and I wouldn't for 1 second want to tar everyone with the same brush, but there are, I won't, but I could name particular individuals who have sent me the most vile and horrible abuse. The mirror side of that is the trans movement, obviously, who, again, not going into details, but again, not everybody, again, could probably come up with 5 names off the top of my head of people who are prepared to email me vile and abusive comments. So, but to me, the lesson here, certainly the lesson that I take from this is not all people in the men's rights movement are angry bastards. But the lesson I take is that people are people, all over the world. there are nice women and bad women, there are nice men and bad men, and I wouldn't like to take any political grouping or identity group or anything and say they're all this or all the other. There are just as many nice people I have constructive conversations with.
Absolutely. I mean, I do agree. I completely agree that there are some very nasty people out there on the internet, and I'm sure some of them are associated with men's rights. Certainly one of the difficulties is that balance between just blocking and moving on with your day, and the reality that it can be, very nasty and kind of impactful. So I suppose just to clarify, when I was talking about the amnesty thing, I wouldn't have been sort of, it's not my belief that everything is, kind of just completely made up. And I suppose I've kind of researched this quite a lot. So I have seen examples of where there's pretty brutal, harassment. But the key difference, and I think this is where it kind of runs into politics, and you can actually see it all the way to the Scottish decision around misogyny, is that my point would be that if you look at Amnesty's methodology, they completely removed male MPs from
Yeah. No, I don't doubt that for 1 second.
But they also removed Theresa May because she didn't fit with, obviously.
No, it's ridiculous. And the fact is, so much research that is conducted on any issue nowadays has the exact same methodological flaws, because I think so much of it, people decide in advance the conclusions that they want to find. And when you've got a majority of women in academia or in research organisations who are feminists, identify as feminists, see the whole point of their research as being with an expressly political feminist agenda, they've decided in advance, either consciously or unconsciously, this is the conclusion that we want to reach, which would be a pro-feminist conclusion. Therefore, the questions they're asking of the data they choose to analyse. So, I mean, even when you look at the gender pay gap statistics, so I've written at length criticising the gender pay gap statistics, but it's very rare that people print actual lies. Often it's because they choose to focus on one part of the data rather than others, or they're kind of ignoring very huge influencing factors, and they're so selective in the questions that they ask that, of course, they're just going to get back from the data whatever it is they want to see. And I agree, that absolutely epitomised the Amnesty study and so much of all the research that we see.
Well, because I may have mentioned the name of my project, The Glass Blind Spots, is essentially trying to define that. It's kind of where people sometimes unconsciously, but quite often consciously, ignore something because it's just not going to get them the result, particularly around the area of equality. And the interesting thing with the Lord Bracknell review of hate crime in Scotland was, whether it was conscious or unconscious, he kind of fell completely into that trap that all of the data and research that he referred to in terms of justifying his decision to put gender in the pot was all research by the likes of Amnesty, where men weren't even included. So, well, here's a controversial thought that I've been kind of playing with recently, which I think helps to define, I think, what one of the problems with all of this is. Do you think it's fair to the extent that equality, the concept of equality and advocacy of equal rights, etc., is largely seen as women's work?
Yeah, I think there is a lot of that. I mean, if you look in universities, for example, one very big project is called the Athena Swan Project.
Yeah.
And that's entirely, I have been very critical of this project because it centres gender equality above and beyond, so if I want to do a project in maths or if I want to research a cure for coronavirus, as far as I'm concerned, if I'm putting together a team to find a cure for coronavirus, I want the very best scientists, I want the very best epidemiologists, the very best virologists, or whatever they're called. I want that best team of people. why do I have to spend an hour filling in a form to tick a box to say how many men and how many women, what role the women will be playing, what seniority position the women will be in? That's a waste. That's an hour of my life I'm not going to spend researching a cure for coronavirus. And it also means then that I won't necessarily end up with the best scientists on the team. I will end up with a gender balance of scientists, which may be the best, but may not be the best. And I wouldn't want to have that in my practice. But the issue is the bigger question that you're asking then, does this become women's work? And I think it does. Quite frankly, I think in lots of universities it is like, we've got a race equality audit to do. Where's a black person to do the race equality audit for us? We've got a gender audit. Where's a woman to do the gender audit? But the proviso I would put on that is often I think women talk themselves into these positions and volunteer and kind of get sidetracked, whether consciously or not consciously, get sidetracked, like volunteer for these positions, and some of that may well be choice. And I think this is for me one of the fundamental problems with our obsession with kind of making everything absolutely equal, because sometimes people don't want everything to be absolutely equal. Sometimes people actually want to choose to do things differently, and I think the time
absolutely equal.
The area this plays out in most starkly, I think, is in terms of the home and the domestic sphere. And you see, again, I think kind of quite bizarre examples around coronavirus, just to be very topical, where we do know as a fact, as a biological fact, I don't think we know why yet, but we do know that men are far more likely to die from coronavirus than women. Now, in some ways, it's quite shocking, the lack of headlines and the lack of attention that's been placed on this. I guess I would be intrigued. We will never know, but I would be intrigued to know if it was the other way around, if a gender balance was the other way around. My suspicion would be there would be an awful lot more headlines and an awful lot more research demanded as to why women were dying at a much higher rate. And it is, I can't remember the exact figures, but there's quite a stark gender disparity. Yet if you look at a newspaper like, let's say, The Guardian, for example, there have been far more articles over the past 12 weeks about how coronavirus is bad for women, because in the domestic sphere, it's women are having to pick up more slack in terms of housework. It's women who are doing the homeschooling of the kids and all of this kind of thing. And, I'm not going to sit here and say there's no truth in that. But what I would say is, clearly coronavirus didn't come with a rule book. We didn't have a letter sent through to all our houses saying, we're now going into a period of lockdown. Women, you must spend the next 12 weeks baking, gardening, posting pictures of your cakes on Instagram, drawing up timetables to home educate your children. So clearly there's been some negotiation in people's homes. Now, I guess feminists would have us believe that assertive men have been saying, oi, woman, get in that kitchen and don't come out until you've done the baking and the washing. My guess is that a lot of women, well, maybe not a lot, I don't know, but certainly a proportion of women have almost welcomed, for whatever reason, and it would be worth thinking about why, but kind of in some ways it provides an identity, it provides a role when all the external roles in the outside world have gone, when your job title's gone. In the home sphere, you can become this figure of wife, mother, homemaker, and it provides a status for you, and it provides a title and a sense of purpose and a role to fulfill. And I can see kind of what's attractive about that. And I think the problem is just we lack honesty. I think women are so used to presenting themselves as victims that women are far happier saying, because of coronavirus, I'm doing more domestic work. Isn't this terrible? And very few women are able to say either I'm not doing more domestic work because I'm sharing it with my partner, or I'm doing more domestic work and actually I'm pretty happy and this is what I want to do?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting. There's a common catchphrase that I often hear from the likes of Jess Phillips and feminists that essentially men's rights activists want to drag us back to the 1950s. And the observation is it's never 1914 or 1945. It's the 1950s. And what you're saying has a bit of resonance in that, in terms of, I think, just the whole kind of concept of family and how families prioritize, kind of their entire lives. And, absolutely, I think kind of a lot of men as well as women have enjoyed the time, to be able to spend more time with their kids. A lot of people are dying to get back to work as well.
Yeah.
There are different sort of balances, but the perspective that sort of so much of adult working time is spent in work now, that there is a sort of separation from child rearing in general. So there's that aspect. The women's work thing I wanted to kind of probe on, because I think it fits very well with the COVID-19 thing you were talking about. The specific example I wanted to look at was the government position in cabinet, the Women and Equalities Minister, who has a team of two other ministers, an Equalities Minister and a Women's Minister, a Minister for Women. Now, these positions have always been filled by women, and I'm not suggesting this is discriminatory of opportunity for men in Parliament. In many ways, it actually strikes me as quite an old-fashioned perspective that sort of, basically, if you're a career politician and you want to be climbing the ladder, the position of women and equalities is not exactly what anybody's really aspiring for, I would argue. I mean, I agree. I think Elizabeth Truss, the current incumbent, is a very good example of that, because she's Secretary of State for Trade and Industry as well, and she's much more prominent on that sort of perspective. So there's that aspect, but then the kind of the difficulty with it sort of being seen as, well, that's kind of women's work, and that's kind of, it's really addressing kind of really women's problems, and more broadly equality in terms of disability and sexual orientation and blah, blah, blah. And particularly disability, actually, because that's another bone bearer for me, is that particularly feminism, but identity politics quite often just kind of trumps the need to address very real barriers for people with disabilities. And that's, another whole aspect. But to get to my point, so you then have the Women and Equalities Committee, who oversee the work of the Women and Equalities Office, who oversee the work of the Equality and Human Rights Commission. And the Women and Equalities Committee have been doing an investigation into COVID-19 and the unequal impact. And I've done a few videos on this. I've kind of assessed their meetings, and you can very much see that. They, just skip over the bit about men dying more prominently. And it is very much, when it comes to gender, certainly, the chair has got a particular be in her bonnet about the fact that hairdressers aren't open, and it's bald men that are responsible for that. So I suppose that's maybe a good example of where I would kind of argue that sort of somebody does need to stand up and say, what about the men? There was this quite startling example recently. You're familiar with Professor Marmot's, the Marmot reports? Okay, so he did a study 10 years ago about health inequalities in Great Britain, and he kind of repeated it recently this year. And it's been mentioned quite a lot in terms of the disproportionate impact of BAME people over COVID-19. And they were discussing it in that context. And absolutely, so basically his conclusion was that absolutely socioeconomic status has a significant impact on your likelihood of how you live. But he was saying sort of, but even, everybody's been talking about the fact that, 24 of the 25 doctors to have died have been black as well, or black and minority ethnic. And that's, nobody understands that, because obviously they're going to have a reasonable, good living, so to speak. And that's been kind of mentioned throughout. It's been mentioned by The Guardian, it's been mentioned in Parliament. It was kind of 10 doctors, it was 12, it's got to at least 24. Nobody seems to have noticed that they're all men. and again, whilst sort of, there's no definitive reason as to why men are dying at greater numbers, but there is quite a lot of evidence around chromosomes and immune systems and, kind of various pandemics like SARS, 75% of fatalities were male. So I guess that's my point, that Professor Marmot was essentially saying health inequalities are all about social factors, environmental factors. Apart from when men die, that's just biological, that's just predetermined. So I suppose my point would be, it takes somebody to stand up and go, "What are you talking about?"
Mm-hmm. No, I think this is absolutely true, and I think the problem is when you get a blind spot, when you do just look at everything through a particular ideological perspective, the danger is that some questions just don't get asked. We don't even raise these questions, but I think. I genuinely don't know, and I don't want to lie and give the impression that I do know, about the biology to such an extent to know about kind of the chromosomal differences that might be triggering this. But it does make me think, tying in what you're saying about the world of work and going back to what we were saying about the domestic sphere, we have equality in so many areas of life. On paper, I mean, men and women are as likely as each other to be working nowadays. We've said the gender pay gap, non-existent. But there are still differences. And I think one area that we don't really explore that gets overlooked nowadays is differences in the types of jobs that people do. It does strike me that one of the reasons why women might be picking up more of a domestic work is because men are more likely to have jobs, particularly I'm thinking about working class men and working class women now, are more likely to have jobs that weren't furloughed, that are still having to get out there and can't be done sitting at a desk in your office at home, but actually need you to get out there, police, firefighters, frontline services, builders, dustbin men, all of those kind of jobs that put people in face-to-face contact with people, whereas perhaps the nature of women's work or work that women are doing, even in retail would be more likely to be furloughed, in catering more likely to be furloughed, and then if you're the one who is at home, then you're more likely to have been picking up the domestic work. But so I am not wanting to be pretending to cite statistics that I haven't got at hand, but certainly remembering back to reports that I read a few years ago in relation to the medical profession. So we have a situation today where more women than men go to medical school, more women than men train to become doctors, but more women than men want to be the kind of the GP in the family practice, and they don't want to be on the front line of A&E departments or necessarily even on the front line of surgery. And, perhaps there's some logical reasons for this. Perhaps if you're thinking already that you want to have a family and you think it's important that you spend a regular time with your children, for women, if that is a priority, more of a priority for women than men, then being a GP where you can work, regular hours in a regular place, and it's unlikely to be a highly dangerous job, they go into that line of work. So it may be the case that more men who work as doctors are dying with coronavirus because more men, statistically, male doctors are statistically more likely to be the ones at 2 o'clock in the morning in the intensive care unit on the front line of dealing with patients as they come through the door with coronavirus. Whereas if you work in a nice middle class GP practice, you're probably being less likely to be doing that.
Yeah, no, I would agree. That's definitely a variable. Age was absolutely something that immediately, jumped out at me as well. And I don't think there was any evidence of people of any of them kind of being one of the ones that returned, to the front line, so to speak. But yes, absolutely, there are various factors. But I find it very interesting that the basic sort of two of the kind of key priorities, and out of that inquiry came three other inquiries. One is around disability and particularly messaging. So I'd be kind of reasonably positive about that. I would expect that. Well, it's about accessibility, but I think the scope should be broader. But the other two were the gendered economic impact, which is you can already tell which way that's going by the discussions I've had to date. But possibly more significantly was the disproportionate impact of the actual virus on Black and minority ethnic people. Now, kind of clearly there is evidence pointing in that direction. I think it's possibly slightly over-egged because there are a few different variables, including using 2011 census data, there's kind of spikes in London and stuff. But there definitely is evidence of that. And yet they're kind of, basically, I think the Public Health Service England report identified that people from Black minority ethnic populations were between 10 and 50% at greater risk, and particularly Bangladeshi, who I think kind of had double the fatalities. Now that's the same proportion as men of working age compared to women. Men of working age are twice as likely to die, and I think it's like 75% of men who die or people who die in the intensive care kind of wards are men. So it's just again that example of that just seems to be that significant blind spot, which is,
yeah,
I'd argue it's structural, but I do think it is, it's nature as well at work. I think people are distinctly.
No, I really agree with you. And I think the problem is there are so many of these blind spots. So, there was a blind spot, one of the most tragic blind spots around care homes. It seemed like nobody asked questions about what would happen if you just discharged loads of sick elderly people straight back into care homes without even testing them. And I agree, in government policy relating to coronavirus, but relating to so many different things in society, you absolutely do have these blind spots, and it comes because people have this, they share an ideological stance. And when you've got people having such kind of coming from the same class background, probably been to the same schools, the same universities, they often live in the same few streets, they go to each other's weddings and birthday parties, they socialize together. And you've got this kind of elite group in society that's, not really that big as a proportion of the population as a whole, like I say, who all know and come to think alike. And that means that these blind spots then are never poked, nobody ever kind of questions, but have you thought about this? So, again, I don't know whether this is true or not, but I read that one of the things that's been a problem with our handling of coronavirus in this country is that people have worked on the assumption that it's flu, and they worked on that assumption that it would spread like flu, and it never occurred to anyone until far too late in the day that this wasn't something that was acted like flu and spread like flu. But, I guess the point I want to make here is that we're not clearly the first people to recognise this and to say that there are blind spots in government policy. And now I'm very, very concerned about this. And I think it's not just government policy, but, in the media, particularly strong in the media, in journalism, in the BBC, you get these ideological blind spots in academia, in all walks of life, this is the case. And like I say, we're not the first people to point this out. Where I get concerned then is that often this becomes the basis of forming a checklist. We don't want these ideological blind spots. We recognise this as a problem. So on our committee of 12, we've got to have, 2 men, 2 women, 2 black people, 2 gay people, 2 transgender people. And
Yes.
the idea, I think, that a lot of people have, which I think is so wrong, I really disagree with it, is this idea that just by having different bodies in a room, you automatically have diversity. And I think if you look at the BBC or The Guardian as very good examples of this, you can stuff a room full of women, of black people, of gay people, of trans people. But if they've all been to the same few universities, if they're all from the same middle class background, if they've all been to the same public schools, if they've all been brought up, they might look different, 2 in a wheelchair, 2 black, 2 gay, etc., etc. You create a very nice kind of gap style advert for your company, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you've created any difference in how people think. You can have people who look very different but think the same.
Yeah, no, look, I 100% agree, and people keep saying that there are sort of all sorts of studies that show that diversity is better for business, but there's actually plenty of studies to show that sort of kind of where businesses put that as the priority, then that can potentially be very bad for business.
You forget to make money.
Exactly, and hire the right people, etc. Let's finish on, because I appreciate your time. Let's finish on a kind of another conundrum, because I'm going to suggest something that I think we need, but I feel very sad about the fact that we need it. And I guess, as you probably guessed, or as I've said, I'm from Northern Ireland, so I'd probably see it as kind of one of those things that is maybe a bridge to getting somewhere better. I'm going to suggest that we need a minister for men. Okay, and I'm sure that thought horrifies you, because it makes me very sad that that's the case. But I'll explain why. At the minute, the framework that I've just sort of discussed, the Equalities Office, the Minister for Equalities, Women and Equalities, the committee, men are explicitly outside, men and boys are explicitly outside of their purview. So, so the Minister for Equalities it's not, whether or not she or they has any view in the matter, it's not in their job description to talk about the lack of the equivalent of Anthea Swan to encourage men into certain professions, or the likes of UCAS to identify, what are the issues in terms of university admissions, or why the domestic violence sector is very segregated in a public service, kind of provision area of, services to vulnerable people. It's literally not, it's not their job to even look at that. So that's why, the very fact that level of essentially structural discrimination exists within government is why I think in the first instance you need somebody in that office speaking specifically about, men's inequalities. But what would you do instead, I suppose, would be the $1 million question.
Mm-hmm. So the first thing I would do would be to campaign for the abolition of the Minister for Women role. I think it's patronising, and I don't think there's any need whatsoever for there to be a Minister for Women nowadays. I don't think women are a special interest. I mean, we're 50% of the population, and more than 50% of the population, and women are, as we've kind of said already, very, very diverse groups. And the idea that you have something in common, because of being female, I think, and it then leads in, I'm sure that has prompted the whole trans thing, which I know is like another massive discussion, so I won't get into that too much. But, this is the logic of where these things take you. So I would abolish the post of Minister for Women. And then I think what's really important in government, but in any kind of governing body, is not having a minister for men or a minister for women or a minister for black people or gay people or whatever, but having more diversity of thought and more diversity of viewpoint. And I think that's something that, we certainly in universities, so much time and effort is put into diversity, but no time and effort whatsoever into kind of diversity of getting different views, different perspectives into the room. And I actually think it'd be possible to have a room full of 12 people who looked exactly the same. I don't care. I really, really don't care if they look exactly the same, but have wildly different opinions and views on the matter.
And really want to be in that particular room as well.
Yeah. But I think that would be far more worthwhile than a room of 12 people who look very, very different, but all think alike. So abolish the Minister for Women, and then really focus on getting people who think differently. And I think that is not a question of, again, the danger whenever you suggest anything like this is it becomes a checklist, so we must have 5 left-wing people, 5 right-wing people, 3 kind of centrists, 2 extreme this, 2 extreme that. I don't think you can do it like that. I think it's a cultural shift that kind of comes with our attitudes towards free speech and goes right back to what we've been saying at the beginning of this discussion about offence, for example, where we actually value having challenging conversations, and we value talking to people who we disagree with as an opportunity to learn, as an opportunity to challenge our own thinking. I mean, as you know, I'm not a men's rights activist. It would have been very, very easy for me to kind of ignore your email or, think that's not something that I want to do. But actually, I think having a culture where we see the opportunity to talk to somebody who we disagree with as an opportunity to learn more about our own position, to grow, to be challenged, to change our mind, and not think that changing your mind is a weakness, but actually see, I've engaged and I now appreciate a different point of view, and I'm going to change my mind because that is actually being a strength of character. And I think that the problem is nowadays that's not valued at all. We get so entrenched into our silos of like-minded people, and actually being able to reach out and respect, and like I said, not even so much respect, but see as valuable different viewpoints, I think is really important and just lacking today.
I couldn't agree more, because I was, kind of very keen to pick your brains, particularly for that reason. I do think we're heading down a scary path with identity politics generally. The very fact that diversity of thoughts, I've seen diversity of thought being described as dog whistle white supremacism. And when you're getting to that stage, it's a very troubling kind of thing. So I'm always very conscious of that when, trying to address the area of male inequalities, because I guess kind of my motivation, I suppose, I've always kind of like stood up for the little guy.
Yeah.
And I don't have any. I'm happily married. I've got a good life. I don't have particular axe to grind in terms of any of my experiences. But it just strikes me as, well, that's clearly the obvious bit in the puzzle.
Yeah.
And possibly if that bit of the puzzle was, there, it might actually, kind of move people away from that automatic victim culture.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think another thing that's really important, why it never ever works just to get, 3 men, 3 women or whatever, because the problem is as soon as somebody, so when I, for example, have spoken out about women's issues and say something that feminists don't agree with, I'm the wrong kind of woman.
Yeah.
Suddenly it's not important to have a woman's voice anymore, not if that woman's going to be me or someone who thinks like me. Absolutely. So you can see the government yesterday, it was in the news, is launching this new kind of race equality audit, and then they've got Pakistani heritage woman Munira Mirza chairing this audit, and suddenly she's the wrong kind of BAME person. So you could have a minister for men You could put a man in the room, but I absolutely guarantee if that's not a man who's singing from the same hymn sheet as everybody else, he'll be the wrong kind of man.
Yeah, I agree. And kind of, initially my perspective is, well, surely if there's an equalities office, it has to look at both sexes. And the extension of the logic as well. In the first instance, you need actually somebody speaking for men to point out how discriminatory the equalities office currently is. But I do agree, and look, it's been fascinating. I mean, I knew we weren't going to be able to solve the woes of the world in over an hour, but I think we have, probed in a few things, and I hope the listeners will find it an interesting listen. Thank you very much.
Absolute
really
pleasure.
Anything you want to plug? What are you up to at the minute? Any big developments?
Well, coronavirus is the huge obsession, I think, with everybody at the moment. And, I think when everybody's talking about the kind of inequality in the domestic sphere, there's one obvious, very, very obvious solution to me, which is get the schools open and get kids back to school. And then men and women can go back to work, get on with their lives, earn money, look after their families, lead a life the way we want to lead it. And 12 weeks now of lockdown, of schools being closed, and it's absolutely outrageous. And people won't look to that as a solution, though. End the lockdown, get the schools open. People, Guardian journalists, again, I'm being very stereotypical now, would far rather squabble over who's done the hoovering, who's done the cooking, than they would say get schools open, end the lockdown, get everybody back out into the world.
I couldn't agree more on that point. And sadly, 6 or so weeks after that chat took place, we're now witnessing regional lockdowns, compulsory face mask wearing, and the possibility of a long, hard winter, watching the further erosion of hard-fought-for civil liberties. Anyway, let me just say a massive thank you once again to Joanna for what I hope you'll agree was a fascinating chat about a pretty complex subject. And thank you very much for listening. If you've enjoyed this content, you can help support this channel by liking, subscribing, leaving a comment, and sharing this video with a friend. I'll be back next week, and in the meantime, don't forget, if you see an elephant...
Can't you see it too? There's an elephant in the room.
The Glass Blind Spot is brought to you by you, because it's your views, your likes and your comments that keep this show on the road.